Welcome to the Center for Healthy Sex monthly webinar. Today's topic is mirror, and my name is Dr. Alex Katehakis. I am the clinical director here at the Center for Healthy Sex in Los Angeles, and today is April 2nd, 2018, the day after Easter, and here we are at the beginning of springtime, and so I like this topic to kick off the spring, honestly, and I'll talk about why more once we get started. So I want to remind you to please text any questions that you have into the text box. I'll do my best to answer your questions directly, or also if you have any comments, because oftentimes those of you that participate with some regularity put comments in the box that are always additive to the conversation. So please feel free to chime in that way. If I'm missing something or you want to elaborate on something, please do. And if you want to ask a question anonymously, because remember Facebook is a public forum and your name will show up if you write something in the text box, you can email Morgan at centerforhealthysex.com. So that's MORGAN at centerforhealthysex.com. So as I go through this breakdown of the word mirror, and as we participate together, I want you to think about the question, how is your identity predefined? And predefined means you were given an identity before you were old enough to start to grapple with your identity. And oftentimes, those of us that are on a path of self-awareness spend a lot of time deconstructing the identity that was handed to us, because we want to reconstruct an identity that's more congruent with who we believe we are. And also who we develop to be, because, we are one thing, every single decade our identity changes if we are curious and if we're really looking deeply at ourselves. So our quote today comes from Yehuda Berg, and he says, "The universe is like a mirror. Say a kind word into a mirror, and it will say the same back to you. Curse into the mirror, and the image curses back. The Creator doesn't inflict punishment or stand in judgment of anyone. It is our own actions that rebound into our lives, like reflections bouncing back from a cosmic mirror." Now, there's a lot in this beautiful quotation. So if we break it down and look at it, he's saying that the universe is like a mirror, and I would say the universe is absolutely a mirror. That when you look at a beautiful sunset or a magnificent valley or the ocean, which is vast and powerful, whatever you're seeing in nature is a reflection of your own self. If you choose to see that you have that same magnificence, beauty, bounty, expansiveness. And so how you look at things makes a big difference as to what comes back to you. And that is his point here too, that whatever you say into the mirror, and I would say whatever you see in the mirror, is what comes back to you. So if you're constantly cursing, if you're constantly aggravated, if your perception is collapsed down into misery, and bad things happen, then that is what you're going to see. And if you see something different, if you see expansiveness, prosperity, abundance, beauty, strength, wholeness, that's what will come back to you also. So think about what rebounds to you, and pay attention today what's rebounding to you based on what you put out there. So we can test this mirror notion by recognizing, first of all, that mirroring is a crucial step in childhood development when the caregiver is acknowledging the child's autonomy, reflecting accurately what the child communicates to him or her. So, for example, if you have a parent that is appropriately and contingently paying attention to that child, what the child is going to get is a reflection of their bounty, if you will. When children are very, very small, they go through a process of what we call omniscience, which is a psychological word, where they think that they are the center of the universe, and they should be when they're 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. That's the age when the parent is meant to be reflecting back a solid sense of self in the child. And it's that solid sense of self that creates a securely attached child. So we want to also not just constantly be cheerleading that child, but reflect back its hurt, its pain, its fear, and regulate the child or reassure the child that the scary situation maybe is not that scary, or the thing they did maybe was bad, but it wasn't that bad. They're not a bad person. And if they're in pain or they hurt themselves, that we want to be there to soothe them appropriately so that their system comes back to a more regulated state after the hurt. And that creates a resilience in the child. It creates a more secure child all the way around. And children, however, will test this mirror all the time. They'll do it by dressing in outlandish outfits or defying conventional taste, or not saying or not paying attention when they're supposed to be. Last night, my husband and I were taking a walk through our neighborhood, and there was a man outside with two very small children. They were probably maybe 4-ish, 3 or 4. They were verbal, and they were running down the street, but not really running. They were running the way that age can run, which is in sort of scooting little steps. And the father kept saying no, but he was saying no in a playful way. He was saying no, no, and the little boy was giggling, and while he wasn't tearing off down the street, he continued to kind of scoot down the street, often looking back at his father, and he was giggling and laughing. And there was an example of the child testing the mirror, testing the no, seeing whether he was in trouble or not and how far he could go. And that's part of his natural growth and development. And that's why it's the parent's job to be able to know how much is too much of a leash and a pullback and how much is too much. And if you were to think about those actual dog leashes that are on those long wires that you can determine how far away your dog is from you, you can either keep it down around your ankles or you can let it go way out. If it's down around your ankles, you're probably going to trip on it. And the dog doesn't get to run and play and explore. And if it's too far out, then the dog could get tangled up in something, or worse yet, hit by a car, because the owner has no control over the dog. And I'm sorry to be using a dog metaphor with a child, but I think that's a very clear visual of how important it is for the parent to have enough tension between the child and themselves, where the child is listening, but it's also got to be a flexible tension, so the child can test the limits but not hurt him or herself. So in a secure household, this kind of self-expression, as I'm talking about, doesn't threaten the parents at all. In fact, they recognize it as a necessary step to keep growing and maturing, and for the child to take its own shape. But in narcissistic environments, meaning where the parents are self-centered and everything the child does is a wound to them. So, for example, that man last night, if he was, short-tempered or angry or controlling, or felt like the child defying him made him a bad father, he made it all about himself, they would have had a very different dynamic there. It would not have been playful. And what I saw was something that was playful but very boundaried. It wasn't, the child could run into the street or was taking off out of the father's control, nor was he this rigid little soldier doing exactly what dad wanted him to do. So every little act between the child and the parent reflects the value of the parent, and that reflection is what creates our own sense of self. So does anybody have any questions at this juncture? If you do, please type them into the text box below. And I also want to remind you that our intake counselors are standing by to talk to you if you have any questions about sex or love addiction or any issues of sexual desire or dysfunction. And our number is 310-842. I'm trying to type it in here. 5093. So can you trust your current reflection? When personal autonomy is outlawed in a family, meaning it's not safe, it's even dangerous, the free flow of consciousness halts and insecurity takes over because the child now has to be guarded. They have to be on the lookout. They're constantly tracking the parent to see if they're okay, or if what they're doing is okay, or if they're going to get in trouble, or they are are waiting for the parent to leave the house, but always hypervigilant about when the parent is coming back into the house. And this kind of restriction on personal autonomy is what has adults later in life really being averse to and even rebelling against authority. So these are people who grew up hating the rules, hating teachers, hating the police, hating anybody telling them what to do, because their very sense of self was constantly being impinged upon. So there's only one place where they can have any sorts of agency, and that's to rebel against authority. And externally imposed identities will alienate individuals from themselves and from discovering themselves and from an authentic experience in the world. And what you'll see is a child or a teenager who's sullen and not very present when you look at them, or they're sort of hunched over, or they're isolated, or even other kids think they're weird. It's because they can't really meet you because their own sense of self has not been championed and developed. So our adult relationships often act as mirrors into past programming. So what do I mean by that? If you get into a love relationship later in life, you may be constructing exactly what you grew up with, because that person becomes a mirror of what your expectations are, what you were programmed to be, how you learn to relate to the same sex or opposite sex. So if you had a father who was, let's say, domineering and shaming of your femininity, or he was worried that he didn't want bad things happening to you, so he went overboard in protecting you from, dating other girls or other boys, then as an adult female, you're going to choose another partner, a female or a male, depending on your sexual orientation, who's going to be as domineering as that parent was, because that's what you recognize as love. And also that part of yourself that makes good decisions for yourself where other people are concerned didn't get to develop. You were sort of time-stamped with the parents' perceptions of those things. And so you carry that forward, but it's not necessarily really yours. It's programming from others. So any questions at this point? So this is where, we start to recognize that this childhood mirroring comes forward into present day. And so when we break through this mirror and realize those relationships also reflect the shared experience of an ongoing process, we can own our past programming, and we can also start to deconstruct it. Because we get into relationship with someone, we think they're nothing like our parents, and ultimately they are exactly like our parents because we've chosen them or we've turned them into our parents. And there it is. You can point the finger of that person and say they're controlling, or they're domineering, or they don't let me have my own experiences, or they don't let me be my own person. But that's precisely what you chose. And so rather than blaming that person, it's about looking at yourself and saying, oh wow, I just chose somebody based on what I grew up with, based on what I know. And so here I have the opportunity to work this through with that partner in a way so that both of us can heal. And so Zarina asks, I see my partner criticizing me by saying that I am too much and it does not fit me anymore. What do I do with that? Well, I'm not sure what he or she means by saying you're too much. Too much of what? Too enthusiastic? Too interested in talking about your feelings? Too angry? Whatever it is, you have to consider what that person is saying, because I think it's important to listen and to take constructive feedback. It can be very difficult to hear from our partners that we are, loud or rude or impatient or not loving enough. And instead of saying, that's not true, that's your issue, which is really kind of an act of violence, What's more important is to say, let me think about that. Have I heard that before from other relationships? Was one of my parents that way? And now I'm behaving that way, even though I didn't realize I was behaving that way. What part of that is really true for me is the question. And yeah, so too much energy, too much enthusiasm. So you're too exuberant, I guess. Well, that I think you're going to have to really have a conversation about, because we can't really dial back our personalities. If you're enthusiastic, if you have a lot of energy, some people would consider that an asset. And if he doesn't have the same enthusiasm or energy you do, he doesn't have to participate or go along with you. You just need to have friends that will be as equally exuberant as you are. So we can't always adjust to what our partners want and need. Sometimes it's not because there is anything that we're doing wrong. It's just kind of the nature of your personality. And in some ways it would be unfair to you to have to kind of dull things down in order to accommodate the other. So you can see how complicated this is. On the one hand, I'm saying take responsibility for yourself, listen to the feedback in a constructive way, try it on and say, wow, I've heard that from other people, so I really want to work on that. I want to work on how maybe my energy is kind of like a whirling dervish and it feels like it's just overpowering for people. And maybe I have that kind of energy because I'm anxious and I want to keep things moving and going instead of just settling down and sitting still. That's a possibility. Maybe the possibility is that this is my nature and I'm an excitatory person and I get super excited about things and I have a love for life. And so I'm going to, be more mindful about that around this person, but I'm also going to let myself be in the workplace and with friends or family. So you have to be discerning about these things so that you don't sort of topple your relationship unnecessarily, but you also don't shut yourself down in order to fully accommodate the other person. So when we become grateful that the more we're driven to seek out personal truth, the more truth we find, these kind of cracks in the mirror or this kind of feedback from other people becomes less and less offensive. It's more a feeling of, oh, tell me more about what you're seeing here. What am I putting out into the world that you don't like, or that it may not be what one person doesn't like, but what I hear repeatedly. If a lot of people tell me that I'm avoidant, or that I'm aloof, or that I'm not really available, or I'm too exuberant, or I'm loud, then I really want to take stock of those things and see what I can do on, to shift and change that and work on it so that, I can be a more wholly integrated person and start to shift and change accordingly. The concept of other delineates everything out there, which we're not. So when we are in a relationship with someone, and even, let me just start with infancy and childhood, when there is another, that is the first time we have the experience that I and mommy are not one anymore. And so all of a sudden everything out there in the world is no longer me. And that includes my behaviors, my beliefs, and sometimes those clash with my own self-concept. So figuring out who I am and who I am in relationship to the world is really what I'm talking about. So we have another question here. Saying that I'm considering adopting a young child age 2 or 3. If I'm being completely honest, I'm concerned that the child will mirror the behavior exhibited by their birth parents rather than whatever example I exhibit for them. Is that a real concern? Is there a time that it's too late to try and change a child's developmental behavior? Well, that's a very complicated question, and I'm glad you asked it because it is concerning. And yes, that child will exhibit the behavior of the people around them in the first 2 or 3 years of life, because that is the way the developing brain and nervous system are come to fruition. It has to have somebody reflecting back and giving input and feedback to that child. So depending on the nature of that household or orphanage will depend on how many capabilities that child has. Now the good news is that with an enormous amount of patience and love and consistency, that can change over time, certainly. What's really more at issue than what the parents were mirroring at that age is what happened from birth until 18 months, 2 years. That is more concerning. Was there a trusted other that consistently attuned to this infant, that cared for this infant, that made eye contact and touched the child and was present when the child was crying to soothe him or her? That will make a big difference in how their nervous system was set up. And then these other behavioral matters, because you said something about concern that the child will mirror behavior. I mean, behavior is easier to change than these deeper structures and functions in the brain and the body. I will share with you that I have a nephew who was adopted at 5 from an orphanage, and he had the good fortune, bad fortune, good fortune, bad fortune of being adopted, good fortune of having had a primary caregiver the entire time he was in that orphanage. And so he was fairly securely attached, even though he was adopted, and so he was very malleable and available to grow into an adult that is highly personable, incredibly loving, has earned a secure attachment, and I think that is, a success story. So it really depends on the child, and it depends on the early environment the child came out of, mainly what was happening in those early years, those first 18 months to 2 years. But good luck, with that adoption. I think adopting children is an extraordinary thing to do. And so we can think about, whether we are talking about an infant or a child, but also remember that our identity develops throughout our life. But it typically stands firm as we start to develop a personal self. And we now know that it takes the brain almost 25 to 30 years to fully finish developing. So that gives us a long time to reconstruct ourselves. And even if you end up in therapy in your 30s for the first time, it's not the end of the world. You can start to shift and change things pretty rapidly also if you stay in therapy with a good therapist, and start to develop a different sense of self. Because we often feel like there's something missing when we go to therapy as adults, like I feel a little dull inside, or I wish I could be more enthusiastic, or I wish I experienced more joy states, or conversely, I feel depressed, or I'm anxious all the time. These are things that stand in the way of a full expression of our authentic self. And these things can often be changed readily depending on the kind of attention that you put on them. So today's the day to really start to think about, what do I put out in the world and what comes back to me? And how do I change what I put out in the world if I don't like what's coming back to me? Because that means that there are parts of myself that are not integrated, that are skewed, and they are probably habituated just because we are unbelievably habituated and automatic creatures. And so we keep doing the same thing over and over again. And we keep attracting the same person over and over again, or having the same problems in our sex life over and over again. And it's not because it's anybody else, it's because there's something going on with me that I really want to challenge and take a look at and see what else I can do to start to reflect on changing my identity so that I can fully be the person that I want to be. So any other thoughts or questions at this juncture? So all we perceive, whether it's a person or a trait we might name, passes through us. And we, will name. Well, first of all, our perception is our reality, and oftentimes our perceptions are filled with judgments. So take a look at those judgments also, and look at your perceptions. And And notice that we construct these things all day long. We can see somebody as beautiful or ugly, as smart or dumb. We can very rapidly close down our perceptions on people as opposed to being curious. And curiosity comes from complexity. So when you are an open person, when you're a curious person, that means there's more space in your nervous system and you're more of a complicated being. You're not seeing everything as black and white. It's all good or all bad. Or, I'm a victim, or somebody hurt me, or somebody's doing something to me. Instead, we're curious about the people in our lives. We wonder what happened that they chose to say that or do that thing, because we know that when we cut somebody off in traffic, it's not because we're being a jerk. It's because maybe we missed our exit, or we put our blinker on, but we didn't see that person. They were in our blind spot. There are a whole host of things that go on. And yet when we get cut off in traffic, we can tend to, get angry or blow our horn or yell at the person as if they're personally doing it to us. And 9 times out of 10, they're not. So keep that in mind as you go through your day-to-day also. And remember that empathic knowledge, or any kind of empathy, allows us to experience all races, ages, and genders. And all that enters our awareness is part of who we are. So when we have empathy and we have compassion from people of all walks of life, of all colors, all religions, all creeds, then we are able to see that those people are a part of our own selves. That our awareness of who that other person is an awareness of ourselves. And when we stop the violence on ourselves, we'll stop the violence on other people. So somebody asks, any suggestions about reconstructing your identity if you didn't get that early? Yes, my best instruction for that, and remember I'm biased, is to get into therapy with a really solid therapist. And when I say that, I usually recommend that people interview, 2 or 3 therapists, meaning, make appointments with a bunch of people, go sit and spend an hour with them, and notice what it feels like to be in their presence. Do they feel kind? Do they feel empathic? Are they listening? Do you feel like you could, over time, trust this person and feel safe with them? Because that is the person that can help you build your identity through the work that you do together. And we can't really create an identity without another human being, because human beings are biologically and evolutionarily designed to come to fruition by way of another person. That's why we need a primary caregiver, a mother or a father. We have to have somebody who's making eye contact, who's listening, who's caring, who's reflecting back to us what they think they're hearing without judgment, who's doing their best to help steward us into fruition. That's what childhood is meant to be. So finding a trusting other, a therapist, is important. Finding a best friend is important also. If you are, if it's appropriate, getting into a group therapy where you have other people that are reflecting back to you, kind of when you are off in some ways, when you're not paying attention, or where you seem like, maybe you're afraid to come forward and risk being vulnerable, or where you are whatever you might be, and I'm saying you in general, so please don't take this personally, but abrasive or angry. We need feedback from other human beings. That's how we grow and shift and change. And the more we risk putting ourselves into forums where we can get that feedback, the faster that process goes. So individual therapy, group therapy, if it's appropriate, a 12-step program, because you'll get all sorts of mirroring back in those forums as well. And all those serve to help us form and forge who we are and also who we want to be. I would add that any kind of service group, whether it's a spiritual group or something where you're giving service to the earth, maybe you are working with the Sierra Club or something like that, in a way that has you engaged with other people, helps you experience how you are in the world. So in individual therapy, we're starting to form and forge our sense of identity, and then group therapy lets us test it out, or we get feedback from other people. and then working in collectives outside of group therapy, whether it's a program or volunteering for an organization, has you being able to try those things out that you learn in therapy. And maybe you get into a snarl with somebody or you get disappointed, you can always bring it back to group therapy and say, hey, I was working, helping plant this community garden this weekend, and I said something to this woman, and she got really offended, and I felt terrible about it. Somebody in your group therapy may say, you do things like that in the group all the time, and I feel offended, but I've never said anything to you about it, so now I'm telling you. And I might say, wow, that's really hard to say, but it's good to know. Thank you for telling me. Now I can be careful because my intention wasn't to be rude or mean. Really, I was feeling scared or insecure, so I tend to sort of shut down, or I'm not very nice, but I want to do less of that. And so the point here is that you're tacking back and forth between individual therapy, group therapy, outside sources, so you can constantly check out how you're doing. And that's the wisest way to use, or I should say maybe the most constructive way to use therapeutic forums. So hopefully that was a good or helpful answer to your question. But I really think, and I want to go back to this one point here, is that it's important to recognize, I think, that all humanity is a reflection of our own self. And it just boggles my mind every day to see the amount of warring that goes on in the planet and the amount of hatred that goes on when we don't recognize that we're actually hurting and killing our own selves. It doesn't matter if you're black or white or Palestinian or Israeli. If a bomb is going off or a gun's going off and a child is being shot and killed, and that mother is wailing, that mother is you. That woman's child was just killed, and it doesn't matter who that person was. If that same thing happened to you, you would be in the same writhing pain. So we keep reflecting our own violence out into the world, and we have an opportunity right now to stop doing that, to start spreading loving kindness, reflecting love and joy back into the world, and that should be our main, revolutionary cause right now and today. Oliver says, I was not aware about my adult behavior is engendering, I was not aware about how my adult behavior is engendering a specific type of treatment from others until I saw them display the same behaviors toward me. That's great. So if somebody is yelling at me, I'm going to be nice, I'm going to be patient, but over time, eventually, I'm going to start yelling back. And then I'm going to hate that I'm a shrew and thinking, what's happening to me? Why am I getting so mean and ugly and nasty? And maybe I start to recognize that because that person's mean, ugly, and nasty, and I don't want to be a doormat, I'm going to start fighting fire with fire. And I think that goes back to what I was saying about warring, is that we start to up the ante, and then finally, when we have our wits about us, we see that, oh, that person's treating me the way I've been treating them, or in the case I'm giving, I might say, I'm starting to behave in the way that that person treats me, and I don't like that anymore. So I'm going to stop yelling back. I'm going to let them know that once they start yelling, I'm leaving the room or leaving the house. And if they don't stop, then I have to get really clear with myself and say, I have to leave this relationship, because I don't want to be treated that way, nor do I want to start becoming verbally abusive or violent. Now, that was a broad example. I don't know what exactly you're talking about, but I really appreciate this recognition that we engender behavior that's coming towards us. Now, sometimes people just are who they are. So if you get out of your car on any given day and you're walking down the street and somebody starts raging at you, it's like, wow, that person's having a bad day, not about me. But when we live with someone or we're in close proximity with that person and we start to see them behaving a certain way that wasn't there when we met them, we might want to consider that we have a part in it and check it out with them. Because if you make yourself vulnerable and say what Oliver is saying, that shifts the relationship fundamentally by saying, wow, I really appreciate your vulnerability, and yes, because you have been whatever, shutting me out of the relationship, I start to avoid you and go away. And I don't want to avoid you anymore. And the other person might say, well, I don't want to shut you out anymore. So then there is a closeness that can ensue from that. And then Zarina asks, what do we do with jealousy that is directed at us? Somebody wants to be smaller to make themselves feel bigger, but over time it's time to leave, or do you have any other recommendations? Well, I think first you have to talk about the jealousy, because people that are really jealous, I think, are projecting onto us what they do. So if I'm in a relationship with you and I'm always saying, where are you going, or what are you doing, or why do you talk to that person, or, I see that you're talking to that woman all the time and I don't like it, at some point you have to wonder, what is it about you that's making you so jealous? You, in this case, we would say me, Alex. And maybe it's because I'm a cheater. Maybe it's because I know that I look at other people all day long and I don't want you doing that. So usually the jealous person has the issue that they're projecting onto the non-jealous person. And that can feel like a horrible, controlling and emotionally abusive situation, because if the person who's being accused is not doing anything they shouldn't be doing, they're chatting with their girlfriend online, they're getting together with friends, yes, maybe somebody attractive looks at you, okay, you're walking down the street, so what? You're not going out with them, you're not getting phone numbers, you're not, having sex with them, big deal. People look at people all day long. If you have a partner who's so insecure that they can't tolerate that, and especially because they know that they cheat, or they give phone numbers, or get phone numbers, or look, that's a no-win situation. That's a dangerous setup for you starting to feel like your own self-esteem is getting worn down. So I would caution you to have a conversation with your partner about that, and let them know that you're not going to shrink because they're not secure, that they need to go work on that insecurity. And if there's something specific that you're doing to make them jealous, then you need to find out what that is, and you also need to look at it. If you're doing things that are provocative and you know that it's exacerbating or aggravating your partner, then that's your part in the whole situation. But if you're not, then you really have to ask yourself, is this the right relationship for me? Because these sorts of things can escalate not just into emotional abuse, but sometimes physical abuse if you're not careful. So, when we step out of these programmed identities, and we start to realize, as I was saying, that we share one life. We share one life with the universe, with the mountains and the trees and the oceans, and I'm not saying this in some bizarre esoteric way other than to say that the planet is a living, breathing entity, just as we are, and we live on this planet, and all the beauty we see is a direct reflection of our own beauty, our own strength, our own possibility and potential. So let yourself break out of your programmed identity today, this small concept of what I call Alex, the small concept of who you think you are. And when you walk down the street today, notice the beauty around you. The vastness of the sky, and recognize that vastness as your own vast potential. Recognize the singing of the bird as your own voice, your own unique song that you have to sing in the world. See the beauty around you and let that reflect your own beauty back to you, as opposed to chasing somebody or looking for love or some guy or female to reflect that back to you because you're so needy and so insecure. Go to nature for that. Go to the beauty of the universe for that reflection instead, and see what happens. And remember that all of the ripples in this one life reflect what Jung called the central self. He imagined that this was the deepest, truest dwelling of our identity, this central self. Other people respond to it as the still small voice inside of us. There are some cosmologies that believe that the power of God or the universe resides inside of us. So let yourself expand into this process of seeing yourself outside of yourself, and what's reflected back to you, not just in the material world or in the world of other people, but in the world of nature, because that will give you, I think, a revelation or an aha moment of what's possible for you. So I started out by asking you in what ways your identity was predefined. And maybe you've had some thought about that today as I've been chatting with you, and you start to see that, oh, my parents gave me all sorts of ideas and ways of thinking and believing that aren't really true for me. And some of those I'm going to put down, and some of them I'm going to just kind of put off to the side, because you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are a lot of good things that our parents give us, and there are also some misguided things they give us because they grew up in a different time, generation. They didn't know what they didn't know. And since we each have to answer these existential questions independently, it can be, sort of self-centered when people claim assumptions are absolute truth. So whatever works for you, if you have this aha moment or this revelation that the answer to changing your self-identity is by surfing every day, then that's fantastic. If that's where you feel the power of the earth, the water, the wind, the waves, the sun on your face, and you recognize that expansiveness as your own true self, that's great, but don't go preaching it to everybody else. We all have to find our own way. We all have to find what's true for us so we can remember and recreate our own identities. And this is part of what can be exciting about being in relationship. If you have a partner or if you're dating somebody, to share how uniquely you find these parts of yourself reflected back to you. Somebody might find it at the beach, somebody might find it snowboarding. One is not better than the other. Or some might find it sitting quietly in their garden, tending to their roses and their flowers. So be open, be open-hearted, reflect back the beauty that you see in all those you meet today, and see what comes back to you. So get out of your head and into direct experience. Let your consciousness flow with the traffic and soar with the airwaves, as it were. That's sort of a Los Angeles metaphor. And realize that you are all the colors in the universe, all the shapes, all the sizes, all the sexes. And then consider, how does it feel to be on the other side also? We can get so one-sided about how we see things politically or in fashion or in religion, and recognize the other as your own self, even though it may not be your cup of tea. Recognize that that person is also on their journey. And so you want to just keep expanding this personal sense of self with some equanimity, and not judge others, and recognize that they too are working on figuring out who they are as well. Laura says, I was in group therapy 6 years ago, but I think I chose the wrong group. And have had adult trauma from all the judgment. Wow. I have a new, more empathic therapist, and I'm having trouble letting go of my anger at the previous therapist. Do you have any suggestions? Well, that's a tough question to answer in this forum, Laura, but I would say that usually when we have anger about something, we haven't let it go. So I don't know how long ago this happened for you. I don't know if it was last month or if it was, 5 years ago. But we really have to work through the anger by, first of all, allowing it, maybe writing about it, feeling the grief and loss, because there's usually pain underneath that anger. But also, I think what's essential here is self-compassion, that you have to recognize that you didn't know what you didn't know, that you got the most out of that group that you could get, and maybe you went there to learn the lesson that you learned, which was something about sitting in a group for 6 years and taking all of that judgment. And that sounds a little bit harsh, but sometimes our lessons come in ways that are not pretty. And what does that say about you, or what did it say about you at the time? So in other words, look at what your part was in sitting there for 6 years. And that is kind of tricky too, because there is a power differential there. Therapists are supposed to take care of people, not hurt people. But in order for you to turn this thing around, you've got to look at what happened that you stayed, what you would do differently now, what you know about yourself now that you didn't know, and have compassion for yourself for staying there because you didn't know what you know now. And then I think you have to really work towards releasing all of those people, the therapist, the people in the group, so that they aren't creating this anger in you, because you're going to reflect that anger out into the world. So the more you can let it go, the more you can wish them well and recognize that they are faulty people doing the best they can do, the better for you. So I think that then brings us to the end of this webinar on mirror. I want to remind you to, when you have a chance, leave us reviews at Amazon.com for Mirror of Intimacy. If there was something about the webinar you liked today, please let us know. If there's something about the book that you enjoy, please pass it on. We always appreciate you spreading the word. And I want to remind you that you are a reflection of all things beautiful and good in the world. So go forth, reflect that back to those you see, and I look forward to talking to you in May. Take care.